Well, pretty much everybody these days knows that smoking is bad for you, but e-cigarettes, with their futuristic casings, their different flavours, well, they seem to promise some kind of safer alternative. But the question is vaping as safe as we've been led to believe? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello and a very warm welcome from me, David Foster. India's banned it. People in the US have been asked to stop after several deaths linked to it. Vaping, electronic cigarettes, well, they were supposed to be a less dangerous alternative to tobacco.
It's hard to deny that vaping, the use of electronic cigarettes, has exploded in popularity in recent years. Sleek, pencil-shaped electronic cigarettes loaded with nicotine and chemicals have many young adults hooked. Trendy brands offer choices. Flavours such as watermelon and grape line the shelves, promising a healthier alternative to traditional cigarettes. But US health officials say vaping could cost people their lives. A recent outbreak of illness has made hundreds of people sick, and 7 people have died. The number of vapers worldwide has been increasing rapidly, from about 7 million in 2011 to 41 million in 2018. Market research group Euromonitor estimates that the number of adults who vape will reach almost 55 million by 2021. But concerns over the risks have led India's government to ban the sale and production of all e-cigarettes, while in the US, health officials are urging people to stop vaping while they investigate the cause of the recent outbreak.
Let us start the conversation. With me at the round table, we have, first of all, Robert West, a professor of health psychology and director of tobacco studies at University College London. Deborah Arnott here, chief executive at the anti-smoking group Action on Smoking and Health, known as ASH. Sarah Jakes here, former cigarette smoker, now a vape user, who's with the New Nicotine Alliance. And from Ireland, we have Dr. Gan Quan, director of tobacco control from the Union, a group which campaigns for better lung health worldwide. Great to have you all here. Let me pick up yesterday's Sunday Times UK paper. Some of the headlines here. 200 health problems linked to vaping. E-liquids trigger rare pneumonia. Who says they are safe, demands vapers' widow. You don't know what you are taking into your lungs. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, everybody thought, well, actually, this is a great deal better than smoking. Now it has become, Sarah, former smoker, public enemy number one.
Yeah, I think what this is several factors coming in together into what's almost like a perfect storm, which is what we're seeing around us now. So we've got, in America, they reported increases in experimentation among youth. And then on top of that, they then had quite a large number of lung injuries, which have subsequently found to be mainly due to illicit THC cartridges.
Which is a cannabis component that has been put into tanks, which wouldn't be there if it weren't sold effectively on the black market.
That's right. They're being sold on the black market by basically drug dealers, and they've been cutting them with something called vitamin E acetate, which is what making people ill. But what that's done now is kind of opened the door for everybody who was anti-vaping or prohibitionist tendencies, which were always there underlying the argument anyway, to come forward. And what we're seeing now is bans and flavour bans and restrictions.
We'll talk about the flavours in just a moment, but Robert, is it as simple as that? Without all of this adverse publicity and everybody putting 2 and 2 together and making 5, vaping is safe?
Well, I don't think anyone has claimed that it's safe, because if you inhale anything into the lungs that isn't fresh air, then obviously there's going to be risks associated.
All right, let me put it this way. Vaping is not bad for you.
I think the best way of putting it is that whatever harms there might be from vaping, excuse me, e-cigarettes, regulated products in the European Union, then it's going to be nothing like as harmful as smoking. And I think though even the people who are really, really pro-vaping would say, look, it's not about people who have never smoked suddenly taking up vaping as a sort of recreational practice, but rather smokers who are doing something that's incredibly dangerous, switching to something that's a lot less dangerous. And that remains true even now with all these stories.
OK, so first of all, I said it's perfectly all right. Then I said it's not dangerous. Now you say it's a better alternative. What proof is there that it is better than smoking for you?
So the
Couldn't it be just as bad?
Well, no. Well, let me put it this way. If you look at the chemicals that are in tar, that are in cigarette smoke, you've got hundreds and hundreds of them, and many of them are known to be really carcinogenic. There's various other toxins that are in the cigarette smoke. In the vapor that you get from regulated e-cigarette products, then you've got almost none of those, and the concentrations that you see of known toxins are much, much less.
Can we get on to the known toxins a little bit later on? Because I want to bring you in, Deborah, and say the danger here is that with all the adverse publicity that vaping is getting at the moment, people will be less inclined to give up smoking tobacco.
Absolutely, and that's our concern. I mean, if you look in America, they are right to be concerned. There have been 13 deaths and hundreds of injuries, lung injuries, caused apparently by vaping.
Can I just put,
but can I just put that in context?
30 deaths or whatever it is
13.
by people, 13, who have been vapers, not caused by vaping necessarily.
Well, they think it's associated by vaping, and I don't think anyone's suggesting that it's definitely not. But put that in context, 1,300 people a day die from smoking in America. And that's the real public health epidemic. And no one's talking about that. And that's what really worries me. So it's out of proportion. As Robert pointed out, this is something that is only really recommended for people who are smokers. Now, smoking, the risks of smoking are so high that there's nothing else that's legal that's as lethal.
Okay, so what is going to happen here? If people get a downer on vaping, and Dr. Quan, I will come to you in just a second. If people get a downer on vaping, what is going to happen in the anti-smoking world? You'll have lost your battle.
The risk is, I mean, in the UK, we've got 3.6 million vapers, of whom over half now are no longer smoking. We are not seeing the sort of problems they're seeing in America. This is an acute outbreak, right? It's not due to chronic vaping over many, many years. It's something due to some substance in a limited number of products. We saw the same thing with olive oil in Spain, something like 20 or 30 years ago. Do you remember? Yes. Yeah. No one said don't eat olive oil. We recognised that it was an acute outbreak due to contaminants in a limited number of olive oils.
Yeah. You see, Dr. Gan, one of the things, I know you fight for better practices regarding health and lung disease, but you're also rather critical of vaping, and you want tougher regulations in China in particular, but you want to come down hard on it and make sure that it's safe. The danger here is not that we would then eliminate the dangerous byproducts or the illicit products that have got into it, which would be a good thing, but that you then put people off giving up smoking tobacco.
In the US and in many other developing countries, we have seen a huge increase of youth smoking e-cigarettes, and that's primarily what's driving the huge concern currently in the U.S., along with this outbreak of several hundreds of cases of illnesses.
It's not smoking e-cigarettes, and that is a real misrepresentation of what's happening. In order to smoke, you've got to set fire to something. The temperature of e-cigarettes is much, much lower than required for combustion.
So perhaps the problem is that we refer to them as cigarettes.
Well, I don't think it helps. I mean, as Robert said, and we would all agree, it's not risk-free, but it's much, much less risky than smoking. I think one of the problems in the US is that they don't actually have a regulatory system in place properly yet, because the bar that was set by the Food and Drugs Administration is so high, they've not been able to implement it. Whereas in Europe, we've had a pragmatic regulatory system put in place, which requires all products to be notified, in this country to our medicines regulator, and they need to say what the products contain and what they emit when they're used. And they have to meet basic standards.
And also the amount of nicotine in them is lower.
It is, yes. And advertising is controlled. You know, in
maybe
Europe...
better controls, and Dr. Grant, we'll come to you a bit more on that in just a moment. But I want to throw something out. Please, at any time, anybody can say anything. Don't wait for me. This is an ASH report, Action on Smoking and Health, it says. And you back this up to some extent, Dr. Gan, by saying in the UK, young people haven't taken up e-cigarettes in great numbers, because you say a large majority of those who've never smoked below the age of 18 have either never used an e-cigarette or are unaware of them. 93.8%.
Yeah.
So
that
it
includes
doesn't.
That includes 18-year-olds, because when we started doing the survey in 2012, if we hadn't included 18-year-olds, we wouldn't have actually got anyone really using them. So we've always done our survey from 11 to 18. Well, 18-year-olds can legally buy e-cigarettes, and cigarettes for that matter. So actually, if anything, it sort of overplays the amount of use by young people, not underplays.
So here we are. We've been talking about whether, in fact, giving up cigarettes are helped by smoking e-cigarettes or by vaping. What about the other way round? Does vaping encourage people to take up smoking cigarettes?
Well, the data that we've got in the UK doesn't support that. And personally, as a vapor, I cannot think why somebody who's vaping mango would want to go on to smoking something that's going to make your cough and taste awful and smell awful.
Because people like to experiment, particularly when they're young, and they take risks.
People do.
But also in the US, Scott Gottlieb, who's now retired from the Food and Drugs Administration, actually said on Twitter that even if e-cigarettes were helping young people move out of smoking, it was still unacceptable to have e-cigarette use. And we have seen in the US smoking rates amongst young people decline much faster in recent years than previously. I'm not saying that's necessarily down to vaping, but it certainly doesn't imply that young people are vaping and then going on to smoke.
Yeah. Robert, we've kept you out of the conversation for a minute or two. Go on.
Just on that point, I think that in the UK, it would be very hard to detect a gateway effect from e-cigarette use into smoking, because so few young people who've never smoked actually use e-cigarettes. It's a really tiny proportion. And I think there are very good reasons for that. And the situation in the UK is different from the United States. We do have much better regulation in the UK and in Europe as a whole regarding things like marketing. Now, in Europe, you can't engage in TV advertising or radio advertising. In fact, there's very limited advertising for e-cigarettes of any kind. And the nature of the advertising is very tightly controlled. If you go to the States, it's like the Wild West. It's very bizarre when you see some of the advertising that goes on for e-cigarettes there. So I think that may be one reason why you're seeing a different situation. But I also want to say one other thing about the situation in the United States, which is that there is talk about a growing epidemic of vaping in the United States. But you have to be very careful about what you consider to be vaping. So what you're looking at is past 30-day use. And a very substantial proportion of the people who report past 30-day use are not smoking every day or even nearly every day. And so I think the truth, as is so often the case, lies somewhere between the two views.
Deborah, I know you want to say something, but I want to go back to Dr. Gan and to talk about the worldwide position here. I'll read you something that I made a note of. More than 20 countries, South America, Middle East, Southeast Asia, have banned the sale of e-cigarette products, but we know that India has banned the production, import and sale, etc. So some countries have banned possession. Thailand has the strictest laws, Australia, Canada, Norway. I'm going to put to you that tighter regulations and lack of availability of these products is going to do to vaping perhaps what prohibition did to alcohol, and in the sense making drugs illegal is going to drive it underground and make it even more dangerous.
Even if we have good policies in place in a country like Indonesia, same as the UK, then its enforcement is a very different story. As we know, the compliance of tobacco control policies is quite poor in those countries. And a good example would be the policy of no sales to minors. I think we all know in many countries, especially in the developing world, kids can still get access to buy cigarettes in retail stores.
But can I ask you, just if you don't mind, to return to the point I was making? And you mentioned China, you mentioned India. I think the number 1 and 2 in terms of smoking per capita in the world. Is not making this something that is proscripted, that it is illegal in so many different ways, going to encourage people perhaps to go down the bad vaping route and actually prove to be more dangerous than otherwise it would have been.
If you look at the tobacco use profile in India, the majority of the tobacco users are either smokeless tobacco users or BD smokers. These are very poor people. Economically, they will never afford to buy electronic cigarettes. The only people who can potentially benefit from e-cigarette use are only about 4% of the smokers. If you compare that to the potential damage of introducing e-cigarette into the market, which is picking up e-cigarette use among kids, as we have seen in the reports of cities like Mumbai and India. And the potential damage is really outweighing the potential benefit. And the industry is really misinterpreting the situation in India. And, if you look at the reports...
OK, only got a limited amount of time. I'm going to bring it back to the table. So we've talked about some of the problems, some of the misrepresentation. Sarah, do you want to start off first of all? What's got to be done to get rid of headlines like the ones I mentioned at the beginning?
There is so much irresponsible reporting in the media that it's absolutely unbelievable. And
but you're not going to change that overnight. How are you going to change it?
How might? Well, I would love to be in every newspaper every day, but that's not going to happen overnight either. But what needs to happen, I think, is that this has got to come from academia, because a lot of these headlines are generated from, how can I put this politely, press releases that are written by activist academics. So we saw some information in, I think it's in that paper that you showed me just now, about a couple of cases, or one case that was supposedly lipoid pneumonia.
This is where you get fat build-ups
inside
the lung.
Let me be very clear about this. There are no lipids in nicotine e-cigarettes. None. And what I see time and time again from doctors, and actually in a case report that was in the BMJ recently, was that the only source of lipids that they could find that this person may have ingested was from an e-cigarette. There are no lipids in e-cigarettes. It's as simple as that.
So to whose benefit would it be to spread what has variously been described around this table as misinformation?
Well,
Would it be the tobacco companies that
Don't look at me.
Is it the tobacco companies that want to make sure that people stay on traditional cigarettes? Well, actually, they're moving into the vaping market. They can see it as a big one. I don't know. Where's it coming from?
This is my opinion, that you've got a sort of accidental alliance between the tobacco industry, who would like e-cigarettes to go away, because they are a threat to their business model, no matter what they say. And unfortunately, some of my public health colleagues who, with the best will in the world, and they feel passionately, and I completely understand that because I do as well, feel passionately about smoking, and they see what happened with the low tar fiasco, where the tobacco industry pulled a fast one on us, and they think, well, we're not falling for that one again. But you've got to look at the evidence, and when you present the evidence, you've got to present it dispassionately. And I'm afraid that's not what's happening. So I think it's absolutely right to be passionate about something and about the goals. But when it comes to analysing the evidence, you've got to really try it. You've got to be reflective and say, well, look, could I be wrong here? Is that, what is the evidence actually saying? And I'm afraid academics are just people like anyone else, and we tend to go with our sort of prior beliefs.
So do we need more investigations into this so that it can be declared by Public Health England, or whatever it happens to be called next month, and other health authorities, bodies around the world, that it can be declared to be relatively?
Well, it is relatively, and it's never going to be absolutely safe. I mean, what I would say is that I do think journalists have a responsibility, because they want negative stories. I mean, we published our new youth data showing there wasn't a significant increase in use by young people of e-cigarettes, and that actually in this country, they don't think they're cool, and the main reason they use them is just to give it a try. Got no coverage in the media because it wasn't a negative story. I think actually the regulator has a responsibility.
The regulator being who in this case?
The regulator being the MHRA, our medicines regulator, which that story in... show me the headline again.
Watchdog dossier reveals 200 health problems linked to vaping.
Yeah,
in other words, somebody said...
Well, basically that's linked to is their yellow card system, where people report adverse effects. So there were 74 cases, 200 different responses from 74 individual people. As you say, there's no proof that it was caused by vaping, just that people had concerns. Now, the medicines regulator should have published that as a transparent public document and put it in context. Instead, they just allowed it to be misrepresented by the Sunday Times, and I think that's really unfortunate.
Dr. Gan, are you one of these people in academia, in public life, accused of scaremongering, of making people frightened of e-cigarettes, of vaping, when in fact they need not be?
We are very much in the position of any policy, be it e-cigarette policy or tobacco control policy, should very much be evidence-based. And that's why we are seeing not enough evidence to support the e-cigarette policy in many countries. And that's where I think the precautionary approach in public policy making should really come in. You really need to wait until you have full confidence in the evidence before you make a policy. Otherwise, one should be responsible for the potential disaster that can be generated.
OK, better safe than sorry is his argument.
No,
How long
absolutely
should
not.
we wait?
I'm sorry, Sarah, you can say this better than I can.
How long should we wait when you've got, in America, somebody dying from smoking-related disease every minute? What are we going to do? Wait for like 20, 30 years and let all those people die without trying or without encouraging people to use something which looks as if it will be a minimum of 95% safer? What do we say to those people that we let die in the meantime?
And I think the other thing is that
I'll come back to you, Dr. Gan, on
the
that
precautionary
one.
principle works in both directions. You need to look at the unintended consequences of allowing e-cigarette use, but also the unintended consequences of preventing e-cigarette use and driving people back to smoking. Now, in the UK, Robert's surveys show that e-cigarettes are associated with significant numbers of people quitting in the population, and a clinical trial has showed that in a stop smoking service environment, they're nearly twice as effective as traditional nicotine gums and patches. What more evidence do you need that it's actually helping people quit?
Robert, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but let's give Dr. Gan not the right of reply on that one, because you're not necessarily the person that this is aimed at, but the question was raised, how many people have to die before you say, let's use this as some kind of safe alternative?
I was actually not trying to comment on the UK policy. As I can understand, there's enough expertise in the room. I was more talking about the policies in the developing world. There are many countries we work in where the tobacco control policies are far from being perfect. For instance, cigarettes are still very cheap, tax is very low, and advertising still allowed. Smoking ban in restaurants are not being enforced. So there's so much that can be done. I think I totally understand why a developing country is not prioritizing e-cigarette policy.
Because I think that's a really important point that he's made. Absolutely right. We need to be focusing our attention on increasing the regulation of tobacco, which we've done in the UK, rather than putting our attention on banning e-cigarettes, which are not making a significant difference.
You still call them e-cigarettes?
Well, that's what everyone calls them.
You say that's
but that's what I say, but I don't say that you smoke them. That's the important thing.
What I'm suggesting, as we wrap this conversation up, is that vaping needs a great PR campaign if it's to take off. It needs to make sure that people never refer to them again as e-cigarettes. And is that going to happen, do you think, Robert?
I'm not sure I would agree with you that it needs a great PR campaign. What we all need, and I completely agree that in every context, commercial and political and cultural context is different. And so to generalise from the UK situation or the US situation to another country, I completely agree. We have to be really, really careful. But what's really needed is for those of us who think we're collecting evidence and research to present that research as accurately and precisely as possible. So when we talk about, when there's a death from a vaping incident, not to talk about it as though it's all vaping, but to recognise what discriminations
We're in the early days, though, aren't we?
Well, it's still quite early days. I mean, vaping's been around for a few years yet, and we do have quite a lot of experience. So those of us who collect data and try to disseminate it need to do that. And then the public health officials need to look at the evidence in the round and develop their policies on the basis of that. And I think, most people are trying to do a good job, but it really doesn't help when some of my colleagues, it is a minority, I think. Some of my colleagues don't necessarily present the evidence in a way that's as nuanced and balanced as it should.
It goes very quickly. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Gan, appreciate it. Sarah, Robert, Deborah, thank you very much indeed. So something to think about the next time you happen to be walking down the street and you're met by a cloud as big as the Flying Scotsman coming out of a tunnel belching steam everywhere. A lot more research still needs to be done, but perhaps whatever anybody's saying at the moment, it is still far safer and far better than smoking tobacco. You've been listening to Roundtable talking about vaping. From me, David Foster, from my guests, from the team that put this together, thank you for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.